All right, in this tutorial, we're going to look at some basics of how Photoshop sees an image, specifically using a tool called the histogram. And we're going to see that play out in curves, levels, and the threshold tool. And ultimately, we're going to do a little bit of white balance with it to a photograph. I wanted to do this series of tutorials because there's a lot that you can do with Camera Raw and Lightroom, but I think it's essential to understand the basics of what you're doing in those tools before actually jumping into them. At least that's what I believe, because I'm a teacher and I believe in these things. So anyway, let's get started. Here we go. All right, so here we are in Photoshop. I have an image open from a trip I took to Barcelona. What I want to show you first is how Photoshop sees an image, at least one way that it does. And that's going to be using a tool called the histogram. Now, the histogram appears in a whole bunch of your image editing tools. So I believe it's foundationally important for you to understand what this tool is doing. So to get to the histogram, you can go to the window menu and click on histogram. If you're not seeing this full view, you can click on the menu and click on expanded view. Now what this is showing you, and there's a whole bunch of different views that you can look at in here, and we're going to look at this thing called luminosity. Now what luminosity means is essentially the brightness of each pixel in the image. And this is showing you a scale, or a diagram I should say, of black all the way up to white, and all 256 stops along the way. Remember, in an image, in what's referred to as an 8-bit image, there is a range of 256 levels of black or white. 0 represents black, 255 represents white. So 255 with the addition of 0 gives you 256 levels of black. So each of these lines on the histogram represents one of those levels. So clustered together, you can begin understanding the range of tone within an image. So in this image, where there is a lot of shadow down here, but not a huge amount of shadow, is represented by this mountain. Over here, this really big peak represents the sky, represents some of the clouds, represents a lot of the highlights in the sculpture on top of this fountain. And then you'll see that there's nothing all the way over to the right that's the bright, bright, bright whites. All right. So this is a tool that we'll be using in a tool called Levels, in a tool called Channels. We're going to take a look at it in a tool called Threshold as well. I just want to point out a couple more ways that you can use this. If you click on the menu, you can go to what's called the All Channels view. And in the All Channels view, you're going to see the red, green, and blue channels. Now, if you're using an RGB image, which we will be for this tutorial, there are 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And I have another video that just goes into detail as to how the red, green, and blue channels work. But this is showing you the amount of light from black to white, from dark, from nothing to full-on light in each channel. And again, these mountains represent this cluster of tonal information. But I want to show you a couple examples of some other images just to show you how what this histogram is representing. Here I have an image that is just a gradient going from black to white. So you can see there's a fairly even distribution across this entire histogram scale of this tonal information. There's probably a little bit more on the ends just because that's the way that I drew the gradient, that there's just a little bit more here and a little bit more on the edge, but for the most part it's evenly distributed. Another gradient that I have here is a is using color. It's going from blue to red to yellow. And you can see that in here there's no black or there's no white, but you can see that darker information is clustered here to the left, which would represent this blue and this purple, and lighter information representing this orange to yellow shift. Now you can see down here in the red, green, and blue, there's different amounts in each one, and you can see that they start and stop at different places. The red doesn't go all the way over to the left, and the blue doesn't go all the way over to the right. And that's, as we look at how color is made in Photoshop, this is a tool that will be, this is a tool that represents that information. Now I also have some photographs. So I have a picture of a polar bear in a snowstorm, literally white on white, and you can see that in our histogram scale, everything is over here towards the right, because that's all this light gray and bright white information, and you can see a teeny little peak here on the left hand side representing our polar bear's nose and his eye. I also have an image of a black cat at night, and you can see that all this information is packed over here to the left hand side of our scale, with just a little information on the right that represents the cat's eyes. Alright, so let's jump into an image. This is linked below, so you'll be using this for your assignment. And what we're going to do is take a look at some of the tools that use the histogram. We're going to start off with one called levels, and we're going to do this via the adjustment layers in the layers panel. So I've pulled my layer panel out here so you can see it. Layer adjustments are found down here. It's the icon that one of my former students referred to as the black and white cookie. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click on levels. And while we do these this demo with the levels tool, we'll also look at the histogram and see what the adjustments are happening. So in the levels tool, and I have the properties of it pop out as well, we can see that there's the histogram, the same one that is in here, that's showing us the same distribution of tonal information. Down here in the blacks, we see that there's nothing ever super duper black, but as we move up the scale to about level 28, level 29, now we start to see that there's some information. And then over here at about level 246 is where it tops out with the brightest information. So one way that you can use this tool is that you can use it to give yourself some very basic contrast adjustments. You can say that instead of black being 0, we can now say that that information that's at level 30, that's going to be the darkest information. And you can see that as I make this adjustment here, what's happening in our histogram, in the histogram panel, is this information is shifting over to the left. Now conversely, if I go to the white point and I drag this over to the left, what you will see is that now the brightest information that was originally in the image, what's referred to as the input, which was about 244, 246, we can now map that to be the brightest information. And you can see that the histogram shifts all the way over to the right. So you could, if you want, just give this a quick little contrast boost, and now you have an image that has some very stark differences between the darks and the lights. But I'm going to bring this back to its beginnings again, just to demonstrate some more things. Now I can take the gray point, or what's also referred to the gamma as the gamma point, and shift that to the right or to the left. As I shift this to the right, what I'm telling Photoshop is that all of this information here, which was evenly distributed throughout the kind of the midtones, all of this information is either 50% gray all the way down to black. And you can see that as I make this shift, my histogram is shifting as well. So as I shift gamma to the right, or grade point to the right, my histogram shifts to the left. And then conversely, if I move this gray point or gamma point to the left, now my histogram shifts to the right, because now I'm telling Photoshop that more of this information is going to be brighter. And I'm going to reset that to 1. Now, what we can also do in this image is we can adjust the individual color channels that make up this image. Remember, this is an RGB image that's called the composite channel, but we can look at all the component channels, red, green, and blue. So if I click on red, now I have a histogram channel in here that I can adjust. If I shift my black point in here, now what I'm telling Photoshop is I want a little bit less red information, because black is going to block that red information from passing. But you can see that I have a big spike over here in white, and that's showing me that to make up the colors in this image, and specifically her skin tone, we have to have a lot more red information. And so that's why there's a large peak over here. So if I shift this to the left, you're going to see that I introduce even more red because it's allowing more red to pass through. If I shift gamma, now I can say, well, I'm going to favor a little bit more red and a little less of the cyan information over here, right? And conversely, if I go to the right, now I'm making the image look a little bit more cyan. Let me set that to 0. And I can go to the red, green, or blue and make those shifts as well. So with green, if I shift the black point over to the right, what I'm saying is there's going to be less green and therefore more magenta, because that's the opposite color in Photoshop. If I shift the white point to the left, I'm going to say there's more green in here and less magenta. And then I can balance this as well. Let's reset that. And finally, in blue, if I use more black in the blue channel, I get less blue and more yellow, which is its opposite. And then conversely, if I go over to the white point and allow more blue to pass through, now I have a bluer image. And I can use this to balance that out as well. So it's definitely a good tool to use for adjusting color balance if you want to. We're just going to look at some other ones along the way. Go back to RGB. Now the last thing I want to show you is down here is the output levels. And what the output levels tell Photoshop is that instead of remapping this information, we're going to say, well, at level, let's say 45, that's the darkest it's ever going to be in the image. And you can see that represented in the histogram, right? It just ends here. There's no information on the left-hand side of the scale at all. And then I can go over to the white point and shift that in, and I can tell Photoshop that there's no information that's any brighter than level 168. Right? So you could make an image that has a very limited range of information in it, and you can see that represented by that histogram and just this cluster right here in the middle. And that's the output levels. In fact, I'm just going to delete it from my layers panel. Oops, delete the whole thing. Now the next tool that I want to look at is called threshold. And that's down here at the bottom. Now the reason that I want to show you this is it also uses the histogram, but it just uses it in a really eccentric way. So I'm going to click on threshold, and what threshold does is it represents the image now from either black or white. So it's using this same histogram scale, my luminosity scale in here, but it only has one slider. And wherever I place this point on the slider, it says from this point over here is white, and from this point to the left is black. So I'm just going to move it left and right, and we can bring out some more detail of her face and then lose other detail as well. And we're going to use this when we do our color balance using the curves tool in a moment, but I wanted you to be aware of how this all works. All right, I'm just going to reset that as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my background image, and then I want to click on, and I'm going to turn off the visibility for threshold, and then I'm going to click on the curves tool. Now the curves tool, and we'll get into this in some more detail in later videos, but what the curves tool does is it's similar to levels, where it allows you to adjust highlights and shadows and increase contrast, but it also gives you this line that represents the adjustment that you're making. But you can also see that there's a histogram scale in here as well. It's showing you this distribution of tonal information in the image. But let's talk about how this tool works, and then I'll show you how to do some white balance. So on the left-hand side, on the bottom is referred to as the input, and on the left-hand side is our black point, and the right-hand side is our white point. The vertical scale is our output. This is what we want the image to ultimately become. So if you follow this line here, which is level 128, and you follow it up, and then where it hits this line over here, that's also level 128. But if I place a point on this line and bend it up, now what's happening is that level 128 is now mapped to level 155. 155 being closer to level 255 means that it's brighter. If I drop it down, I'm now saying that level 128 is mapped to level 107, and now that's saying that this is darker. But because this line is bent on a curve, these adjustments now they're happening at every stage along this levels until it comes back to this point. So what that means is that you can place multiple points on here as well, and you can place a point here to make the darks a little bit darker, and you can place a point here to make your brights a little bit brighter. All right, so that's one way that it works. Now to get rid of these points, just click and drag off the screen, and you've essentially reset this. Now what you can also do is you can change the shape, or just the angle I should say, of this curve. You can make it a little bit steeper, right? And by doing this, you are essentially doing what you've just done in levels by remapping the black and white points. You're saying that now at level 24 is going to be remapped to level 0, and up here at level 246 is going to be remapped to level 255. So that's essentially what we've just done in levels. Again, I'm just going to reset this. If I go the opposite direction, it's essentially what I'm doing with the output levels, right? Where I'm taking away, kind of clipping the image at either end. And you can see in the histogram exactly what I'm doing. There's no information on the left or the right. I'm just going to reset this. Whoops. All right, so what I want to do is I want to use this tool to establish some white balance. And this image is a little bit warm. The background's a little bit warm. And I want to neutralize everything, so I'm going to have a really good starting point for any kind of color work that I might do a little bit later on. Now what I want to also do is I'm going to expand the histogram again, and so we can see what's happening in the red, green, and blue channel. So what we can see here is that, if red, there's a lot of information here, green more or less in the same location, blue more or less in the same location. But as we get over here to the darks, red ends here, green ends here, and blue ends here. And so this is a really great tool to visualize exactly how the color balance is working, or the white balance, I should say, is working in your image. What we would like is for all of these, the red, green, and blue channel information, level information for all these channels to be more or less the same shape. And they will never be exact, but we want them to be more or less the same shape. So we're going to keep this up as we do our white balance. Now, the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use some of these tools in our curves panel, in particular this eyedropper for white, eyedropper for black, and an eyedropper for the gray point. But we need to find out where white and black are, or the brightest parts of this image are. And that's where threshold comes into play. So I have my curves layers below my threshold layer. If you don't have that, just make sure that this is below it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my threshold adjustment layer and make sure that you're clicking on the icon for it. And what we want to do is we want to drag this all the way over to the left until we're only revealing like a few little dots of information. And what this is showing us is those are the darkest parts in the image. I'm going to zoom in, Command-Control+ to zoom in. And down here, now this is an area that I believe was her shirt or her hair, and that's pretty much the darkest part of the image. I'm going to go over to my toolbar, and I'm going to click on the Color Sampler tool. And what this is going to allow me to do is just drop a little marker here to indicate that this is the darkest part of the image. All right, so that's my blacks, or my shadows, the darkest, absolute darkest part. Now I'm going to drag this all the way over to the right, because what I want to do is try to find the highlights. And it looks like somewhere over here on the left-hand side, which I'm hiding with my histogram panel, so I'm going to just move that over. Over here is definitely like the brightest part of the image. So I'm going to, again, go to the Color Sampler tool and place a marker here in the highlights. All right, now what I can do is I can turn off threshold, and I can click on the curves. And now what I can do is I can tell Photoshop exactly where the white point and the black point is, and then the gray point, we're going to do that a little bit more on an arbitrary way. So first I'm going to click on the white point. All right, and I'm going to take this eyedropper and click here on number 2, and now that's saying, all right, that's the brightest part of the image. I'm going to go to the black eyedropper, go down here to my number 1 point, and now I'm telling Photoshop that that is the darkest part of the image. And you can see that the curve for all the different levels has been adjusted. Now I'm going to take my gray point, and this is where you have to be a little bit more, this is a little bit more arbitrary. But what we want to try to do is find what you think is the grayest part of the image. And there's ways to do that. It's a little bit more advanced. I don't want to get into it just yet, but because this is shot on a fairly neutral background, it's easy to figure out. So you can click here, right? That tends to make it a little bit more blue. You can click in her hair, which tends to keep it a little bit much more neutral. So I stick with this point here. If you click over here again, that's going to make it a little too blue because you're picking up on the color cast of the background. But in her hair is a little bit more neutral. Right? And so now what we've done, if you look at the histogram, things have evened out a little bit more. Now the blue doesn't go all the way over to the left, and that's fine because we don't want that blue cast, but you can see these things are fairly lined up in our histogram. And so what we've done here is we've established some really good white balance for this image. So export your files as JPEG and submit it to the assignment if you're doing this for my class homework. If not, I'll have some more videos that talk about color balance, and then we'll do some color grading with this image as well. All right, thanks for watching.